You might wonder how opium and life insurance are connected. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Stay tuned.
You are listening to Wealth Talks with the McPhees. What in the world might opium have to do with life insurance or not? That's an interesting tagline. There's got to be an interesting story behind this.
Well, drugs, taxes, and your personal economy have a lot to do with your ability to build sustainable wealth. And, you know, way back in before Christ, 400 and some years before Christ, Hippocrates said that opium should never be used unless it was in a very distinct and confined medicinal reason. And yet, just 100 years later, Alexander the Great brought the use of opium to the people of Persia and India. And then later, you know, the Portuguese initiated the concept of smoking it, and wasn't long before the old Silk Road was opened to China, and ships chartered by Elizabeth I were instructed to bring the finest opium back to England.
Interesting.
Now, this wasn't for medicinal use at that time. In fact, the Dutch were the primary dealers in opium throughout the 1700s, and causing the Chinese emperor to restrict the sale of it because he saw the damage it was doing to his populace. And yet that continued to increase, and there were actually 2 wars fought over opium, where China restricted the trade of opium coming across its borders, and Britain and eventually France even got involved in this, fighting the Chinese to allow opium for them to continue to import opium into China.
So they were trying to put opium into China because it made their political interests in the area better, because it decreased the will of the Chinese to fight back against them.
It did. And in the 1800s, addiction was just rampant throughout Asia, Europe, and the United States. And products were sold over the counter called Dover's powder and Lendandium. They were less expensive than alcohol to purchase.
Wow.
And so it was about that time that the French chemist, the German chemist, Frederick Serturin, I guess I'm pronouncing that right,
Okay.
was able to isolate morphine from opium. It was the first alkaloid ever to be isolated in. And then following that, atropine, caffeine, cocaine, and quinine were also were alkaloids that were isolated from it. But this chemist from Germany, he called it God's medicine. Okay. And, you know, there are uses for opium even today. Morphine is a very powerful painkiller. If you're going to have your leg amputated, or you're going to have chronic pain, there could be some use for that. But the addiction that has occurred because of this drug and the scourge is just amazing. Mm-hmm. And many times, as we look back through it, it was governments that were pushing opium onto other countries to oppress them. Today, we've got fentanyl coming in from China across the southern border of the United States. It's almost an exact opposite of what was happening in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's fascinating that this opium eventually led to the Alexander Wood of Edinburgh to developing the syringe to make it more easily assimilated into the body through injection. And so even our hypodermic needles have a trace back to opium and the opium trade.
Fascinating.
So it's these type of things that government do that inhibit our freedoms and our ability to make right choices. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until the 1920s that the U.S. Treasury, long before the FDA came along, began to ban the purchase and importation of opium and other narcotics. And, it was a day late, a dollar short. But it's...
So where were the narcotics coming from at that time that were making it to the black market?
Well, they were coming from, they were primarily brought into the United States and sold through Chinatowns. And, that's not a political correct term today, I guess, to say. But
that was back in the 1920s.
It was back in the 1920s. And it wasn't until the 1940s, during World War II, that the shipping channels for these drugs was actually blockaded, and we were able to limit the supplies coming into the country.
Interesting.
But then it just shifted to the Hmong farmers in Southeast Asia. It shifted at one time to Mexico. And then our government actually used Agent Orange in Mexico to spray the opium products. So we get the government involved in things, and things just kind of just go to pot real quick.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
Interesting. So with everything that was happening in the U.S. and Mexico, they were spraying. Agent Orange is a big buzzword today, but they were spraying these drug crops, and so the production shifted back a little bit to the Middle East after that. So it went back to Afghanistan and Iran. Those became some of the news sources for opium.
And it was a known fact that at the time we went into Afghanistan, over 20 years ago now, it seems, that we could have brought the Taliban to their knees if we would have destroyed their opium products.
Fascinating.
And yet we chose not to do that. Why? Who knows? But it's a very fascinating history to study the way that governments use drugs to direct their policies.
Interesting.
Their foreign policies.
So what about all the changes in policies that are happening at the state level today, like the legalization of marijuana and even some of the opioids? Because, people say, well, some of these drugs are safe and useful. Shouldn't people be able to use them recreationally as long as they don't hurt others with it?
Well, what's happening today is that drugs are becoming, or that used to be illegal, are being made legal. Oregon now, you can carry narcotics with you up to a certain amount without being, and of course, many states are legalizing marijuana. Alcohol has been legalized for a long time. We know that prohibition doesn't work. The government tried that, and all it does is drive it into the black market. But at the same time, governments only legalize something when they can make a profit off of it. And that's why California alone last year netted another, $1 trillion in marijuana tax. It's very profitable for them to legalize it now because they're going to tax it just like they do cigarettes, just like they do alcohol, just like they do many other things. And that's the only reason we're seeing states move toward this. It's not for more freedom. It's more for more taxation.
It's for the revenue. Interesting.
It's just like the lotteries. They used to ban the lottery. The lottery has a huge tax. It's supposed to go toward schooling and restructure, but much of that gets just dumped into the general funds of states. And it's just another way to tax the poor because it's the poor and the poor and lower middle classes that are using these drugs the most and that are paying the tax.
Fascinating. So what is the solution to drug usage? Obviously, there's the micro level where certain people can take responsibility. Is there any solution to this on the macro level?
Well, governments, I don't believe, can control drugs, and they shouldn't try to. That's my opinion. We need to be taking away barriers to teach morality to our children so that they can make right choices about what they do. Just because something legal doesn't make it right. I'm always amazed at what happens on people's 21st birthday. They think that's the time they can go out and get plastered just because they're legally allowed to drink at that point. Well, that sets up a bad norm, a bad standard. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's morally right. And,
big difference.
And governments can't control that because all governments have the ability to do is tax and make and put fear in you. Those are the two powers that they have. Put you in jail or tax you for it. That's the only way they can do anything about it. And it's obviously not working to tax it. it obviously didn't work to penalize it, because then our prisons were all filled up with first-time drug offenders, right?
So you're saying this is really a more of an issue at the cultural level with morality in the culture.
It is. And the same holds true with our finances and money and life insurance. No amount of government intervention or regulation is going to make people wealthy. You can't take from one group to give to another without disparaging the people you took from it. And if you kill their morality or their desire to one out and be productive, all you do is
drag everyone down.
You drag everyone down. There's no more upward mobility when you reach a certain point. To develop wealth, one has to overcome the way they've been programmed to think. Jesus talked about the story, you can't put new wine into an old wineskin, or the wineskin will burst, and both the skin and the wine are destroyed. So we've got to begin to think different about who we are and what we are, and realize, and no amount of government regulation or control can make that happen. It comes from within. So at Life Benefits, that's why we have the formula, hard work plus mutual respect for others plus education times your faith is what's going to produce sustainable wealth for you. No amount of government regulation can control drugs, drug abuse, importation, exportation. No amount of wars have been fought over this. It all comes down to, what am I going to do personally? And so what are you going to do personally about building a sustainable wealth for you? We know government hasn't worked because 90% of Americans today that are retired are dependent on Social Security for their income, or they would be at the poverty level.
Fascinating. So we started out the show today by saying, what's the connection between drugs and life insurance? It seemed very far-fetched, right? You've heard the story behind the drug usage in the world today, and now you realize that the solution is what connects these two things. Life insurance can help you to become more wealthy. The solution to the drug problem is very much similar. You have to take personal responsibility, and you have to recognize the moral values that are going to change that cultural norm.
And when the government does offer a program, we have to be very careful about what's in the fine print.
Oh, that's
earlier this last year, we were encouraging people to look into taking the SBA loans that the government was providing due to the pandemic.
Yeah, last year and earlier this year. And there's a couple different ones of those, the PPP loan, which helps with payroll, and the EIDL, the Economic Injury and Disaster Loan. And so it's always worthwhile when you're looking at those loans. They can be good things. They can help tide cash flow over. And the idea for some of the people taking these loans is they wanted to use the cash flow that would be freed up, even if they ended up not needing that money, to do something else with, whether it was in their business or maybe they planned even to take a distribution so they could use that money personally. Well, this is where it pays to take a look at the fine print before you decide exactly what you're going to do with it. If you look at the fine print on these loans, there's a couple of paragraphs in specific that we're going to mention. On page 5 of 11 of the loan authorization agreement, if you had planned to take distributions out of your business, that's not allowed without permission of the SBA while the loan is outstanding. So you're not
this could
supposed to
really
take distributions.
cripple someone who is taking a base salary and adding distributions throughout the year to augment their income.
It could.
So that's just in the fine print of this SBA loan.
It's in the fine print. Another one is that if you planned to move your business, then that may not be allowed either. Relocation using the SBA funds is not allowed.
And that's just with the EIDL loan. That's just the SBA EIDL loan. That's not the other SBA
loan. That's not the PPP loan. Yeah. So whenever government gives something, yes, they often take something away in the background. You might think, well, what's the penalty for doing these things? Well, if you violate any of those terms, then the loan can be considered in default, and they could come possess any collateral, force you to pay it back. I think if they determine you've violated any of the terms, then they can require you pay back 1.5 times the amount loaned. So there are stiff penalties for it. Whether they'll be enforced or not, we don't know. But you should at least be aware that if you're using the loans and if you plan to do any of those things with them, you should be at least aware of the consequences.
So drugs and life insurance and SBA loans, we've covered the gamut today, but they're all. If one thing we can learn from this, don't trust the government to believe everything they tell you without reading the fine print, and realize that oftentimes when the government makes something legal, like qualified plans, that doesn't mean it's the best thing for you to do, because it may not be in your best interest. Just like California's collecting over $1 trillion now in marijuana tax, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone that's using marijuana is getting what they need.
Exactly. Quite likely the opposite in many cases. So you are listening to Wealth Talks. Be sure to protect your wealth and take responsibility for your actions across the entire spectrum of your life, whether it comes to what you put into your body versus how you're managing your wealth. You're listening to Wealth Talks with McPhees. We'll be back next week.